This Sicha, in addition to being a Sicha connected to the Parsha Shavua, is also a siyum on Masechta Baba Kama, a siyum that the Rebbe made in connection to Chafov, the yahrzeit and Hilula of the Rebbe's father, Rebbe Levi Yitzchak. The Rebbe says, from this that the Eibishter says to Moshe Rabbeinu by the second set of luchos, Psal lucha shnei luchos avonim karishonim, that he should carve out 2 stone luchos like the first ones. The Gemara learns out from the word psal lucha that the psoil is the leftover chips of the luchos. Shel chayehei will belong to you, to Moshe Rabbeinu. Now we have a Mishnah in the siyum of Masechta Baba Kama, and there are various different halachas regarding a worker that's doing a malacha, doing work for a balabayis, and there's leftovers. There's things left over from the item, from the article with which he was working, whether it belongs to him, to the worker, or it belongs to the balabayis, to the owner. So we have a Mishnah. The Mishnah says that those shreds of wool that the launderer removes from the piece of clothing that he's washing, harei elu shaloi, so he could keep it. V'shahasoyrek moitzi, and that which one who's combing the wool ends up with, again, some little pieces of material, that needs to go to the owner. So what's the reason for this? Because that which the launderer ends up getting little bits and pieces, little shreds of the material from the garment by washing it, is going to be something very, very small, insignificant, on which the balabayis wouldn't care, wouldn't mind, and therefore it belongs to the launderer. But that which comes out from combing the wool, that's going to belong to the owner, because that's going to be more of a davar chashuv, something more important, as Rashi explains, and he wouldn't be moichel, he wouldn't easily just give up on it. The Mishnah then goes through other cases as well, when we say it belongs to him, to the worker, and when we say it belongs to the balabayis. The Mishnah says, Masha hachorosh moitzi b'matzod, the little shavings, the little tiny chips that a carpenter will get out when he's using a plane, when he's trying to smoothen the wood. So that will again be very, very little tiny chips. Harei elu shaloi, that's going to belong to the carpenter. But that which he does, bekasha, which is some sort of axe, and therefore it's going to have bigger pieces of chips of wood, shal balabayis, that will belong to the owner. And then the Mishnah concludes and says, V'im haya oisa eitzel balabayis, if this worker is actually working in the property, in the house of the balabayis, of the owner, then even nesoiris, even sawdust, even the little tiny sawdust that is caused by a drill, which is very, very small and seemingly insignificant, yet it will belong to the balabayis, it will belong to the owner. The Gemara then brings a beraisa, Tanu Rabbanon, Mesatze avonim, those that chisel stones, ein bohem mishum gezel, they're not subject to the laws of theft. In other words, they are allowed to keep the little bits and pieces, again, that are being chiseled off the stone. Now, in regards to this beraisa, the Rebbe Maharash says, and this is brought in a small little rishima, it's written very briefly. It was actually written by the Rebbe Rashab. It was in connection to a siyum that the Rebbe Rashab's brother, Menachem Mendel, the Rebbe Maharash's son, made on Masechta Baba Kama. And the Rebbe Maharash asks, regarding this din of Mesatze Avonim, that those that chisel stones, there's no dinim of gezel, they're basically allowed to take whatever they want. And this is what he says, V'tzarich lahavin, so we need to understand, if that's the case, why does Hashem need to say to Moshe Rabbeinu, Psal Lucha, that you could keep the psoilos, that you could keep the little bits of the stone of the luchos, since we just said there is no concept of gzela by little bits and chips of stone? In other words, they are hefker, they don't belong to the owner. The Rebbe Maharash says, V'ha'umen karav yoisel, and the worker is closest to these chips, so automatically he should be able to keep it. So if that's the case, why does Hashem need to say psalacha? And the Rebbe, in other words, automatically he should be allowed to keep it. Moshe Rabbeinu should be allowed to keep it. The Rebbe Maharash answers that there's a difference. In the case of the luchos were made of sanpirin, which is the name of a very precious stone. Whereas the Mishnah is discussing, or rather the Gemara, the Beraisa that we just mentioned, is discussing ordinary stones. There it was a precious stone, and that's why Moshe Rabbeinu would need special permission to be allowed to have the psoilas, the leftovers. Now the Rebbe says that seemingly this beer of the Rebbe Maharash, that the psoilas, the leftovers of the luchos, Moshe Rabbeinu needs to have a special permission from Hashem for the psalacha to be allowed to have it. Why? Because it's of a precious stone. Says the Rebbe, this would only be necessary, this explanation, based on, according to one of the opinions we're about to mention right now. The Rebbe says, we know that there's a machloikas, there's two opinions in the Medrash. We have Rab Levi and we have Rabbi Yochanan arguing from where Moshe Rabbeinu carved out the luchos. One opinion says there was mitachas kisei hakoved psalon, that he carved it out from under the kisei hakoved. One opinion says mitoich aholoi, from Moshe Rabbeinu's own tent. Hashem created, made like a mine of stone, of precious stone in Moshe Rabbeinu's tent. Moshe Rabbeinu carved out the luchos from there, and he was able to get the leftovers, and that's how he became rich. Because, as said before, that it was San Pirinun, it was a precious stone. So now, according to the first opinion that the luchos were carved out from under the kisei hakavoid, and this, again, the first opinion would be that it was from under the kisei hakavoid, and the second opinion is that it was carved out from within Moshe Rabbeinu's tent. And down here, the Rebbe says, this is also obvious from the simple meaning of the psukim, according to the second opinion. Why? Because Moshe Rabbeinu is told, only after he carves out the luchos, what's he supposed to do next? And then, come up to the mountain. So too, when he goes ahead and fulfills it, we find Moshe Rabbeinu says, I made the Orein of Atzei Shittim. I carved out 2 luchos of stone like the first ones, and I went up the mountain with the 2 luchos. And so too in Parshas Kisisa, it says the same thing. So again, according to the first opinion, it was all done mitachas kisei hakoved, but the second opinion is saying that it was done down here. Now, according to the opinion that it was done up lamaila, it was carved from under the kisei hakoved, so then we wouldn't need a reason why Moshe Rabbeinu needs permission to take the psoilas. We don't need the reason that it's because of a precious stone. Only because it's a precious stone, Hashem has to tell him that you're still allowed to keep it. Why? Because the halacha is, as the Mishnah says, we quoted earlier, if the uman, if the worker is working in the owner's place, in the owner's property, then it automatically belongs to the owner, and therefore he wouldn't be allowed to take it. So Moshe Rabbeinu, even if it was a simple stone, would need Hashem's permission. So in other words, since Moshe Rabbeinu is working by the Baal Habayis, by Hashem, we don't need the heter of, he would need that heter of psalachot to be allowed to take the leftovers, because otherwise it should belong to the Baal Habayis. It's only if we say, if we go according to the opinion that Moshe Rabbeinu did it down here, so down here, the chips would have automatically been Moshe Rabbeinu's anyways, had it been regular stone. And that's why the Rebbe Maharash needs to explain that it was an Even Toiv because it was this precious stone. That's why he needed permission. Okay, now, the Rebbe continues with the Rishima of the Rebbe Maharash. It says over there that the Rashbatz, a famous chassid of the Rebbe Maharash, asks that seemingly to Hashem, even an Even Toiv is completely insignificant. What's the difference between a stone or a precious stone? Because again, we said that why did he need permission? Because it was a precious stone. But compared to Hashem, a precious stone is just like a regular stone. To which the Rebbe Maharash responded, Harei ason lamata, but Moshe Rabbeinu had performed all of this down here. Because the things that happen l'mayla, there would be no psoilas. There's no psoilas up in the ones above. Whether it's referring to the first luchos or generally l'mayla, there's no psoilas. So again, we see this idea that clearly it was done down here. And again, so because it was done down lamata, so here we obviously are counting the way things are viewed down here lamata, and therefore there's a difference between regular stones and precious stones. But automatically, again, we see this idea that we said before, that clearly the Moshe Rabbeinu is not working, so to speak, in the domain of the Balabayis, as we said before. Moshe Rabbeinu is doing everything down here, Lamata. However, the Rebbe says there seems to be a difficulty. Because after all, Eitzel Balabayis working in Hashem's domain is all over, even down here. Meloi chalaretz kavoidoi. To use an expression chazal that's brought even in halacha in regards to other things, that wherever anything is, it's always, so to speak, within the storehouse of Hashem. La Hashem aretz loya. Everything belongs to Hashem. So seemingly, even if Moshe Rabbeinu is doing it down here lamata, nevertheless, would be the psalacha. Where is he carving out the stone? It's still Eitzel HaKadosh Baruch Hu. He's still working by Hashem. And therefore, seemingly, even if it was regular stone, Moshe Rabbeinu wouldn't have been allowed to take it without Hashem's explicit permission. So why is the Rebbe Maharash then saying that it's only because it's a precious stone, that's why he needs Hashem's permission? Again, seemingly, even if Moshe Rabbeinu is working down here and carving it out down here, he would still need permission to take those chips, even if it wasn't a precious stone, because he's working by Hashem. He's working within the domain of the Balabayis. Now, even though you're going to say, you can argue now on the other side, and said if you're speaking about Hashem, you can't say that the Balabayis is going to mind even about the little chips, even about the little pieces. Because obviously Hashem, compared to Hashem, nothing matters at all. Nothing, it takes up any significance. And there's really no difference even between precious stones and regular stones, as the Rashbatz pointed out. So you might say, who cares if it's in the house of Hashem? A regular person, if it's in his house, he minds, then he'll want to keep even the little things. But Hashem, even if everything is in the domain of Hashem, but you might argue and say, but Hashem surely doesn't care about little pieces of stone. But as we quoted already before, the Rebbe Maharash says that Moshe Rabbeinu did it lamata, meaning to say, we are basing things how we look at it in this world, down here, and the dinim, the way they're viewed in this world, there definitely is a difference between, first of all, simple stones and precious stones, and also that we do look of how things are viewed down here lamata, and the dinim are looked down here lamata. So we can't just say, oh, Hashem doesn't mind, because we clearly see, for example, in a halacha, that when we're doing something for Hashem, we always need to use the very, very best, the nicest, kol chaylev la Hashem. We don't just say, oh, it doesn't matter to Hashem. So if that's the case, even if it's an ordinary stone, since it's Eitzel Balabayis was still within the domain of Hashem, Hashem is the Balabayis, and we just said we're looking at things the way they're down here in this world. So once again, if it's in the Rishus, if it's in the domain of the Balabayis, then we need to say that the Balabayis does mind about those little pieces. And therefore, again, in conclusion, the question still remains, if everything is in the domain, in the property, in the possession of the Balabayis Hashem, so Moshe Rabbeinu would have needed permission, even if it's a simple stone. Again, why do we need to emphasize that it was a precious stone? In fact, says the Rebbe, we were just suggesting that nothing matters in the eyes of the Eibishter. You might actually say the other way around. Since Hashem didn't create anything in vain, so you can actually ask the other way. Hashem would mind about everything, even about the simplest things. But the bottom line is, again, this is the nakuda of the question. Why do we need to say that it was a precious stone? Seemingly, even if it's a simple stone, you need to have permission. So the Rebbe starts off by suggesting that maybe you could say that in regards to stones specifically, there's actually no difference between working by the Balabayis or working on your own. In other words, that even if you're working by the Balabayis, you could keep the extra little pieces of stone. Why would we say that? Because when we look in the Gemara, where does the Gemara bring this beraisa? That misatze avonim ein b'hem mishum gezel, that when it comes to the little leftovers of the chiseled stone, there's no concept of theft. The Gemara is bringing it not in the section of the Mishnah that's discussing the dinim, whether it belongs to the worker or to the Balabayis. Rather, it brings it in the section v'im hoya eitzel Balabayis, that if he's working by the Balabayis, then the Balabayis gets to keep it all. And on this, the Gemara then brings a beraisa that by people that chisel stone, so then it definitely belongs to the worker, which makes it sound like that when we say chiseling stone, there's no concept of theft, is not only if he's working in his own place, but even if he's working by the balabayas. And the Rebbe says this could seemingly be proven when we look at the other cases of that beraisa. The beraisa goes on to speak about that mefasge ilonois, people that are pruning trees or pruning grapevines. Again, we're going to learn soon the dinim of those, but the point is, these are things simply that, of course, you're working. Where are you working? You're working in the rishus of the balabayas. You're working in the vineyard of the balabayas. And yet, as we're going to see, in many cases, the worker could keep those things. So therefore, you might say over here as well, even if the worker is working by the balabayas, when it comes to chiseled stone, he could keep it. And based on this, we'll be able to explain what the Rebbe Maharash says, that we need to say that Psal Lecha, why does Hashem need to tell Moshe Rabbeinu that he could keep it, is because it was a special stone. Because if it was a regular stone, there would be no difference if it's in the owner's house or it's in the worker's house. In both cases, Ein Behem Mishum Gezel, there will never be considered a concept of theft. However, the Rebbe is not satisfied with this. The Rebbe says it's a doichik, because the svara, to be able to differentiate between the work that the worker is doing by the balabayas or not, would seemingly apply also by those that are chiseling stones. So why would we say that there should be any difference between stones and the other cases of cutting wood, etc.? Especially that we don't find any such thing that any poskim should say that by those that chisel stones, we don't have this halacha that if it's in the balabayas' house, then the balabayas keeps it. Furthermore, says the Rebbe, even in the words of the Rebbe Maharash in that above mentioned Rishima, what does he say? He says that when the person's cutting the stone, chiseling the stone, we said the balabayas doesn't care about it. And the worker is closer to it, which makes it sound like that by those cutting the stones, this concept of Ein Behem Mishum Gezel, it sounds specifically that when it's not by the balabayas. Because had it been by the balabayas, we can't say that the uman is closer. Why is the uman closer? Why is the worker closer? It's by the balabayas. Says the Rebbe, in order to understand all of this, we're first going to have a look at a difference about how these halachas are brought in the beraisa that we spoke about, and how the same halacha is being discussed in the Tosefta. The Rebbe says, in the beraisa divides these halachas into two separate cases and situations. First, the beraisa says, Mesatse avonim, those that chisel the stones, Ein Behem Mishum Gezel, there's absolutely no theft. Then it starts discussing other cases. Mefasge ilonis, those that are pruning trees, those that are pruning grapevines, those that are pruning thorn bushes, or other weeding sort of vegetations and vegetables and so on and so forth. The beraisa says that it depends. If the balabayas cares about these things, he's particular about these things, yesh b'hem mishum gezel, then there is the prohibition, you're not allowed to steal them, you're not allowed to take them for yourself, there's gzela. If the balabayas is not particular about them, he doesn't care about them, harei shaloi, then you could keep it. What did we see over here? Regarding avonim, it seemed to make just a blanket statement. There's no gzela. Regarding these other things, we made a differentiation whether the balabayas cares or not. Now let's look at the Tosefta. The Tosefta puts it all together as one case. Misatse avonim, mefaske kfanim, menakve higin, etc. All of these different things, menachshe zroim, all of these different things, we say it depends. If the balabayas cares, then you're not allowed to take it. There's gzela. If the balabayas doesn't care, then you're allowed to have it. There's no gzela at all. So what do we see over here? There seems to be a machloikas between this beraisa and the Tosefta, whether by stones it even matters if the balabayas cares. Do we say, no, stones you can just keep, we don't care about what the balabayas thinks? Or do we say, no, it 100% matters whether the balabayas cares about it or not? What's the reason for this machloikas? The Rebbe actually points out that in the Tur, although he brings the din of mefasge ilonis and oidre yerakos, those that are pruning the trees and those that are pruning the vegetables, etc., which are words that are only brought in the Beraisa and not in the Tosefta, so you would think that it's following the Beraisa, and yet it says like the Tosefta, that just a plain blanket statement, it says like the Tosefta that regarding those that cut stones, it does make a difference whether the Balabayas cares or not. So how do we understand this difference? So the Rebbe starts explaining and saying, according to the Beraisa, clearly there's a difference between those that chisel the stones and the other cases, like those pruning the trees and the vegetables, the plants, and so on and so forth. Why is that? Because in the case of mefasge ilonis, pruning trees or other similar sorts of things, clearly there's more chashivus in these things, there's more importance to these things that are being cut more than by the little bits of stone that are falling off. And therefore we would say that the balabay, it depends if the balabayas cares. If the balabayas cares about these things, then it's considered gzeila. If the balabayas doesn't care, then you could keep it. Or, as it discusses over there, it sometimes also depends on the place. If it's a place that people generally don't care, the minig anshe Medina is not to care about these little things, then we'll actually say, even if there's a particular balabayas that does care, then Butla Daita, we don't even take his opinion into consideration because the derech of this place is that people don't care. So now in this case, when we say that it depends on the Kpedas Balabayas of how much the Balabayas cares, or the Balabayas doesn't care, we can now have, within this itself, two svaris. What does it mean? How does it become now the workers? Why is it becoming mutar if the Balabayas doesn't care? Do we say, one way of looking at it is that we say that since he doesn't care, it's as if he just basically made it hefker, and therefore it should technically be hefker to anybody, not only to the worker itself, or to a specific person, it's just generally hefker. So that's one way of looking at it. Or do we say it's more like a matono? We're saying since it's something so small, it's like the owner is giving it, he's ready to give it to whoever is going to be taking it. And this is even shaloi midaito, even if the owner technically doesn't know right now that the person is taking it, but he's giving it to the person as a gift. So that's in regards to these other things that have some sort of chashivus in a little bit of a way, or we said a tiny bit of chashivus at least, but the owner doesn't care so much. So again, either he's making it hefker or actually giving it away. What does the Beraisa say regarding mesatze avonim, regarding those that chisel stones? Ein bahem mishum gezel. What that means is that the chshivus of these little crumbs of stone, of rock, that are coming off are even less than the pruned trees. By them, we don't even need this concept of ein balabayis makbid alein. We're not even saying it's about the balabayis not caring about them. Rather, because they are worth so little, because they're so insignificant, they're on their own, inherently almost. They are completely hefker. That means these are things that have absolutely no chshivus, no value to people, so on their own, automatically they are hefker. And because of this, even if there's going to be a balabayas that says, I do care, Butla Daitoi, his das will be nullified, wouldn't count, and not only because this is compared to other people that don't mind, but rather because, again, be'etzem, there's like no balabatashka, there's no ownership on something of so little value, on something so insignificant. Again, to use the words of the Rebbe Maharash in that Rishima, where he's medayik, he says, O pirush, mipnei sheim hefker, they are hefker, they don't belong to the owner. Or to put it slightly in different words, in the case of mefasge ilonis, in the case of those that prune the trees or other similar things, where you say that it depends whether the balabayas cares or not, or we might say it depends on the minig anshe amokim, as we said before. So then we say that the geder of hefker, or we said matono, is all mitzad the person. We call it the gavra. It's as far as the person is concerned. Either he made it hefker, or he's giving it as a gift. But the thing itself has at least some sort of chshiva, some sort of value. where if we say that Ein Bohem Mishum Gezel, there's no concept of Gzela at all by the Mesatzei Avonim, or some of these other Kshus v'Chaziz, which are like unripe grains and other types of vegetation, which we say that there's absolutely no Gezel at all, it's more like the Chefza itself, the object itself on its own is Hefker. It has nothing to do even with the person, with the Balabayas. Says the Rebbe, now we could start understanding the reason for the difference between the Beraisa and the Tosefta, where we said that the Beraisa just said that there's absolutely no Gzela at all by the Avonim, and the Tosefta sort of put it together with the other things that it all depends on the Kepedas Balabayas, whether the Balabayas cares or not. How do we understand this? So the Rebbe first starts discussing the general difference between Beraisa and Tosefta. The Rebbe says this is brought in the Mefarshim that explain the Klolei Hashas. And that is, Tosefta are generally things that were added to the Mishnah. And therefore, they're never brought in Gemara wouldn't start off with Tanya or Tanu Rabbanon. The Toseftas are basically things that Rab Chia learned in front of Rebbe and was further explanations on the Mishnah itself. And Rebbe would tell him, write this, write it in this way, write it in that way, and so on and so forth. As the Gemara says, regarding a specific thing, it says, Rebbe loy shana, Rab Chia minayin loy. If Rebbe didn't teach it, how would Rab Chia know it? In other words, these are things that were clearly taught in the Beis Medrash of Rebbe, which Rab Chia discussed with Rebbe, and so on. On the other hand, Beraisos are other kinds of, similar to Mishnayos, but these were things that were said not in front of Rebbe, not with Rebbe's knowledge, etc. These were outside of his Beis Medrash, and these were compiled and made by Rab Chia, Rab Oishia, other Chachamim, but not under the authorship of Rebbe. In fact, the word Beraisa itself is from the word Baro, which means on the outside. They were outside the Beis Medrash of Rebbe. So again, Toseftos are things that were done in front of Rebbe, Beraisa outside. Says the Rebbe, if Tosefta, Rab Chia, organized and authored in front of Rebbe, that means where was it said? It's in Eretz Yisrael. That's where Rebbe's yeshiva was. On the other hand, Beraisis, which were done outside the Beis Medrash of Rebbe, that's very possible that it was learned in Bavel, especially Rab Chia came from Bavel. And generally, the Rebbe says it makes sense that Beraisis are much more connected to Bavel, because we know that in the times of Rebbe, Yidden had started going out to faraway places in Golus, etc. Bavel became the main center of Torah. So therefore, the Rebbe says Beraisos generally are much more connected to Bavel. So now let's look at a difference between Eretz Yisrael and Bavel. We have a pasuk. This is in the story of the Doir HaFlaga, Migdal Bavel, and all of that. The pasuk says the people Hava Nilben Olavenim. They say, let us make bricks. And the bricks, the pasuk says, were for them like stones. They used them as stones. Why do they use brick as stones? Rashi says, She'ein avonim beBavel shehu bika. And Bavel was a place of a valley. There were no stones over there. They needed to use bricks. Because stones were something completely not available there. And therefore, says the Rebbe, if stones is something that Bachlal not used in Bavel, so therefore, if someone did have stones, which clearly we brought for somewhere else, etc., stones themselves are not even used, so the little tiny bits and pieces broken off from stone are completely valueless. And therefore, the Beraisa, which again, Beraisa is mainly in Bavel. What does the Beraisa say? Misatze avonim, those that chisel the little bits and pieces off the stones, ein by mishum gezel, there's absolutely no concept of theft at all taking them. They're inherently, completely hefker, again, in Bavel. And therefore, even if someone, the owner would say, I do care, we don't even look at his opinion. On the other hand, in Eretz Yisrael, and again, this is where the Tosefta was made, where avonim is a more common thing. It's used for building and for other uses. In fact, Eretz Yisrael is praised. The pasuk says, Eretz asher avoneho barzel. So therefore, even the little bits of stone are important, or at least have some sort of significance, at least like the bits that are being pruned from the vines, from the grapevines, etc. And therefore, it's going to depend now, does the Balabayas mind or does he not mind about it? Says the Rebbe, now we can understand what the Rebbe Marash is saying in that Rishima. Because now we're going to look what happens by Moshe Rabbeinu. Is it more similar to Eretz Yisrael or more similar to Bavel in this context, in this sense? Yidden at that time are going in the Midbar. In the Midbar, clearly, stones are not a regular thing that you're using, that you have. Although, of course, there are avonim mentioned in the Midbar. For example, the Rebbe says in the story of the Mekoshesh Eitzim, where he did an Aveira, Mechilul Shabbos, and he was stoned. But generally, not really using much stones in the Midbar, especially not for building. You're not building permanent structures over there. The Yidden are traveling and Vayisu, Vayachanu, Vayisu, etc. So therefore, it would be more similar to what? To Bavel, where there's no stones. And therefore, what would we say? Misatze avonim, those that are chiseling stones, there's lechatchila no concept of gzela in the little bits and pieces. To use again the words of the Rebbe Maharash, mepnei shem hefker, they are hefker, they don't even belong to the owner. They're completely hefker because of the chefza, because of the object itself, not only depending on whether the owner cares or doesn't care. So if that's the case, that was the question originally, that why does Hashem even need to tell him, psalocha, you should keep the psoilus? Now we can understand the question. Because again, originally we didn't understand. We said seemingly if he's working by the balabayas, maybe the owner does care, so, etc. And therefore he has to be told, psalocha, you're allowed to keep it. But now we understand, no, when it comes to stones in the midbar, there's absolutely no caring about it no matter what. So if it would be just regular stone, the Eibishter wouldn't need to tell him, psalocha, you're allowed to keep it. Of course he's allowed to keep it. And this is what the Rebbe Maharash says, that there's a difference between a precious stone or regular stones. So by the din of a precious stone, so therefore, technically, there would be a concept of gzela. You can't say like by a regular stone that there's no concept of gzela, because a regular stone has absolutely no chshivus. But of course, the little chips and the shavings of the precious stone definitely do have chshivus. And therefore, we can understand why Hashem needs to tell Moshe Rabbeinu, psalacha. Now the Rebbe looks at one more detail within the words of the Rebbe Maharash. It said, "Ha'uman karov yoiser lazeh," that the uman, the worker is closer to these little chips, and that's why he could keep it. So now the Rebbe is explaining that what does this mean? We don't mean compared to Hashem, because again, we're not even looking at it now as the issue is that he was working by Hashem. How could he keep it, or that he needs permission to keep it? We're not speaking about that at all. What we mean rather is, why does he get it more than anybody else? Uman Karav Yoiser, he's closer to it than anybody else. That's why the Uman gets to keep it. And therefore, because he's closer to it, that's why he's automatically koine. In other words, originally we thought that because the worker is closer to it, that's why that's why it's not the balabayis, the worker gets it. Now we're saying no, because the worker is closer than other people, that's why the worker ends up getting it. Or Moshe Rabbeinu ends up getting it. The Rebbe now moves on, and the Rebbe now goes to another explanation of why Moshe Rabbeinu needs the heter of psalacha regarding the luchos. Looking at it from a totally different angle. Till now we were looking at it, is that Moshe Rabbeinu needs the heter to keep it, rather than that it belongs to the Eibishter, so the Eibishter is telling Moshe Rabbeinu, you could keep it. The Rebbe is now going to look at it a totally different way and saying that Moshe Rabbeinu is allowed to keep it, even though technically who should it be? The Yiddens. So the Rebbe says like this, the fact that Moshe Rabbeinu needs the heter of psalacha is not because the psoilis, the leftovers, belongs to the balabayis, to Hashem, but rather because the luchos. Now remember, the luchos are in the Aron, in the Mishkan, and like all matters of the Mishkan and the Mikdash, the luchos, and together with everything else, belongs to the tzibur, belongs to Klal Yisrael. It has to be given over, as the halacha is. Everything in the Mikdash needs to be given over, l'tzibur yafa. It has to be given over after it was made, or lechatchila, even before it's made, that it belongs to the whole tzibur. It has to be the asiyah, the making of it needs to belong to the tzibur. And therefore, that's what Moshe Rabbeinu is going to need the heter for, so that he's allowed to keep it, that it doesn't automatically go to the tzibur. So Hashem needs to tell him you're allowed to keep it. The Rebbe says this could also be understood from the continuation of the Gemara, where the Gemara says, "Le'nitno Torah elo leMoshe," that the Torah is given only to Moshe Rabbeinu himself, as the pasuk says, "Ksav lecha," and it also says "Psal lecha." The Gemara learns that just like in Psal lecha, it means Moshe Rabbeinu was going to be owning those leftovers, so to Ksav lecha means that the writing of the luchos is also Moshe Rabbeinu's. What does it mean the writing of the luchos is Moshe Rabbeinu's? The Gemara explains that it means the pilpul of Torah. The concept of pilpul belongs to Moshe Rabbeinu. It was given to Moshe Rabbeinu and not to the tzibur. Later in the Sicha we'll see that Moshe Rabbeinu shared it with Klal Yisrael. So therefore the Gemara says, just like the pilpul of Torah was given over to Moshe Rabbeinu and not to the tzibur, so to Psal L'cha, it's going to belong to Moshe Rabbeinu, and that's what he's being told. You're allowed to keep the psoilus. It's not going to belong to the tzibur. That's what the point was. Now, even though you could say that what's the chidush that Moshe Rabbeinu is allowed to keep it and not the tzibur, seemingly, if it's going to belong to the tzibur, to Klal Yisrael, even if it's made of a precious stone, how much is going to be left for every yid? Definitely less than a shava pruta for every single yid. And the concept of loy sigzol doesn't apply unless it's a shava pruta, because Torah only obligates in matters of mammon, in matters of money, and less than a shava pruta is not even considered money. So you might say, so what's the chiddush that Moshe Rabbeinu is allowed to take it? So the Rebbe says, no, it's definitely a chiddush that Moshe Rabbeinu is allowed to take it, because obviously you're not allowed to steal, and you're definitely not allowed to steal the money of a tzibur, no matter, even if it's something less. And you can't just come along and say, Ein bohem mishum gezel, there's no gzela, because clearly you're not allowed to steal even a tiny drop, and that's min haTorah. Question is whether it'll go to Beis, whether Yechayiv and all of that. So therefore, Moshe Rabbeinu needs to be told clearly that even in this case, even though technically the luchos belong to the tzibur, nevertheless, and the psoilus should have belonged to them, the Eibishter is telling him you could keep the psoilus. The Rebbe concludes the Sicha with a biur pnimi in the idea that we find differences in the bailus regarding the luchos shniyos, that we're saying that the luchos generally belong to the tzibur, to all of the yidden. And regarding the psoilus, we're saying it's going to Moshe Rabbeinu. So the Rebbe says, in regards to the giving of the Torah, the way it was given by luchos shniyos, there was the chidush, as the Gemara goes on to say, as we mentioned before, that the psoilus belongs to Moshe Rabbeinu. So too the ksav belongs to Moshe Rabbeinu. And the way we mentioned it earlier is that the Gemara explains that this means the pilpul of Torah was given to Moshe Rabbeinu. And the Rebbe says that this is the deeper meaning of the words, which we mentioned earlier from the Rebbe Maharash, that he said, Harei ason lamata, that Moshe Rabbeinu made the luchos down here, because the luchos of up above, there would be no psoilus. That is, the Torah, the way it's coming with Tzad L'mayla, which generally is the Torah more associated with the first set of luchos, is on a level of achdus. There is no concept of separation. There's absolute unity. There's definitely no concept of psoilus in the inyanim the way they are L'mayla. Regarding the first set of luchos, we said, every way you looked at it was just looking at it from the front. There's no leftovers, there's no extras, there's no back. Everything is front. As Torah comes down lamata, which generally that's like the idea of luchos shniyos, which are given already after the tshuva for cheto egel. In other words, this is a tshuva that was poil kavayochel l'mayla, that they should be given the luchos. Now we suddenly have what's called the chalkos madregus within Torah itself. Now we have many different levels. There's the higher levels of Torah. There's the front. There's the back. There's a concept of psoilus, even so to speak, the leftovers kavayochel. So says the Rebbe, now let's understand the connection between what we said, that the psoilus belongs to Moshe, as well as the ksav, which is the pilpul of Torah, belongs to Moshe. So the Rebbe says like this: the pilpul that Moshe Rabbeinu was given is something very, very great. This is the opposite l'chayra of the union of luchos, of the psoilus of the luchos, which we just said seems like a very, very low level. But the Rebbe explains, specifically through the luchos shniyos was achieved the idea that there's now going to be the concept of yigiyah in Torah, of effort, of toil in Torah, as explained at length in Chassidus. Now in this idea, we find two opposites coming together. On the one hand, the yigiyah in Torah, toil in Torah is coming because of concealments, because of questions, because of problems. That sounds more like the psoilus aspect of Torah. There's, compared to the etzem, the essence seichel of Torah, which is clear. On the other hand, it's specifically through that yigiyah that we come to the deepest part of Torah, to the essence of Torah, higher than the way Torah is on its own. And higher than the way Torah is, even as far as luchos harishonos are concerned, as explained in Chassidus at length. And this is the idea of Pulpula Doiraisa that was given to Moshe Rabbeinu. The Gemara calls it Pulpula Ba'alma as if just Pulpul. Just Pulpul was given to him. But on the other hand, we say that really this is the idea of Havana v'Charifus, of understanding and the sharpest and the deepest aspects of Torah, such a high level of Asagas HaTorah. And in fact, Moshe Rabbeinu acted in a generous way with this, and he also shared it with the Yidden.